Why must all good things come to an end? Just asking questions. This will be our final episode of Just Asking Questions. What follows felt like the kind of sincere, analytical, deeply meaningful conversation across an ideological divide that would be appropriate to call our last. Liz and I will offer some of our final thoughts at the end of the episode, so please stay after the final question for that if you've been with us on this journey and would like to hear our reflections. It does feel like something has shifted, right? Today we're going to talk about the horrific assassination of Charlie Kirk with writer Freddie deBoer, who's written a remarkable piece at his Substack attempting to make sense of what he calls these spectacular acts of public violence. That's spectacular as meant to create a spectacle. The motive of Kirk's killer has become much more clear as text messages and family statements released by law enforcement reveal a young man in a relationship with a transgender partner enraged by Kirk's supposed hatred. We examine and interpret his words in detail in this episode. But from deBoer's perspective, it's not ideology leading to violence, but a profound lack of meaning and wallowing in nihilistic online irony that continually leads young men, often egged on by internet friends they barely know in real life, to desperately graft a semi-coherent grievance onto their final violent act in a doomed attempt to make it meaningful. deBoer is a proud leftist, and we ask him whether this is a pathology that's particularly prominent on the left, where unapologetic celebrations of this murder and the murder of United Healthcare executive Brian Thompson before that are disturbingly present. It's a conversation that I hope inspires you, as it did me, to reflect on what it is that's meaningful to you. What's the effect of an increasingly disembodied and digital world on that meaning? And how to avoid pushing our culture any further in the direction of producing rampant celebration and dehumanization of a father and husband who was killed for the words he spoke.
The weird just asking
There must
question.
be conspiracy, and you're just asking questions.
We're just asking questions.
Just asking questions. Just asking questions.
We are entering into an epistemological crisis.
You cannot cope with vast amounts of information in the old fragmentary classified
In
patterns.
this information crisis,
There was a notion that unfettered communication was always going to be
The
good.
right to speak comes from our rights to know.
Freddie deBoer, we wanted to talk to you today as the country and our political system is still reeling from the assassination of Charlie Kirk, because beyond the pure tragedy of a young father being shot in the neck in front of his family and the world, this horrific spectacle and the reaction to it seems to have knocked us onto new and even more treacherous terrain. And you've published an essay that I think tries to step back and take a survey of that terrain and offer a kind of map to understand it in a way that's not partisan or even particularly ideological. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Freddie, you've expressed a fear that I think many people share, that the assassination of Charlie Kirk is sort of the beginning of something bigger. You wrote that each violent act will serve as an accelerant for the next, as the cascading violence will help the people who commit this violence see their work as some sort of broader movement that gives them the meaning they seek. What is it about our current moment that's giving you that feeling?
Yeah, so I think I should probably step back just a bit and say that I think that Charlie Kirk is a prominent example, but I actually don't think this is the beginning. I actually have been writing about this for years, and I think you can go back. Just the Abundant Life shooter, which was the private school shooting from just a month or two ago, which many people found to be sort of incoherent in ideological terms. Or one of the things that I wrote was the Thomas Crooks, the attempted assassin of Donald Trump, who is a person who has been widely described as being defined by this blankness, to the point that it's invited a lot of conspiracy theory because this human being seemed to have no politics.
Sure.
I'm looking at all of these things in succession, and I look at a world in which we have done a really good job at undermining traditional forms of meaning without replacing them with anything. And we have just hosts of young people who are brought up in digital domains that are not, I would argue, conducive to a healthy sense of self, and who don't have real sort of goals that are achievable for most people, right? They want to be rich and they want to be famous, but those obviously are not replicable for many people.
I'm sorry,
And
is this an interview with Freddie deBoer or with Ross Douthat right now?
well,
Like,
you know,
it sounds a little bit like you're saying the young men need to go to church a little bit.
well, for me, not the church because I'm an atheist, but I've been like, let's sort of take this to something that's a little less extreme than school shooters or whatever, right? Look at like the concept of work in the late 20th century. You have a series of major cultural touchstones that indicate the widely held belief that office work, basic white collar work, is something that is ridiculous, that is pointless, that is soul deadening. You have movies like a comedy like Office Space, but also Fight Club has this theme. The Matrix is a major theme, is like the anomie and the meaninglessness of late 20th century office work, for example. So you take this form of employment, which was widespread enough that many people sort of were involved in it. American Beauty is another movie that was involved in this. And you say this is not worth doing. This is not a site of meaning. What you're doing has no value. And core to all of these narratives, I mean, this crops up again in like The Office, the original British version, and then in the American version, the people involved in these places know that they're not doing anything of meaning or value, and that's part of what weighs on them. So you say, okay, well, we're gonna ironize that away, but what are you replacing it with, right? So you have sort of the demise of blue collar work that can provide a living wage. That my best friend's father started out at the assembly line at Pratt and Whitney in Middletown, Connecticut, in the 1960s. And by the time he retired, he had the title of engineer, and he was making a very good living. And he was able to sort of work his way up with only a high school education and put three boys through college, in his own home, etc. So that's gone in most places because of deindustrialization for various reasons. And then so now you take the white collar alternative and you undermine that. You make it into a site of something ridiculous. You teach people that it's not worth doing. And what you're left with is, a sea of people who have very narrow sort of ideas about what is actually like meaningful or fulfilling work. I tell people all the time not to go to grad school. As someone with 2 graduate degrees, I tell them all the time not to do it. But I completely understand where the urge to go to grad school comes from, right? Because many of these people look around and say, where can I find meaning in what I'm going to do next, right? I think that a much sort of darker and more intense and pointed version of that is something that's growing in a lot of these online forums, where you have a lot of young men who are steeped in the harshest possible irony, who perform emotionlessness for each other, and they don't see any value in themselves, and they're willing to die to gain notoriety.
Let me try to apply that template or use it to examine this specific case of the killer of Charlie Kirk, because there were for days just rampant speculation about what his motives are. That's become much more clear as of yesterday, as of this recording, because of some text messages that were released by the Utah attorney's office. I'm going to pull those up right here. So, I mean, actually, before I even get into this, I think part of the motive is obvious and has to be stated, that Charlie Kirk was speaking on a college campus and he was shot in the middle of speaking. And so I think that the motive of silencing someone whose views that someone didn't like was clearly part of the motive. But this text exchange reveals this is with his roommate, who's also believed to be his partner, who is a trans person. And he had left a note underneath his keyboard, according to this document, that confessed to the crime. And this is the ensuing conversation after the roommate discovered that note. The roommate says, "Why?" The killer says, "Why did I do it?" Roommate, "Yeah." The killer, "I had enough of his hatred, of Charlie Kirk's hatred. Some hate can't be negotiated out. If I'm able to grab my rifle unseen, I'll have left no evidence." Down here it says, "Remember, I was engraving bullets. The fucking messages are mostly a big meme. If I see notices bulge UWU on Fox News, I might have a stroke." There were other engravings about catch this fascist. There were other meme-related engravings. And then just to continue just a little bit here, Robinson's mother explained over the last year that he'd become more political and started to lean more to the left, become more pro-gay and trans rights-oriented. When asked why he did it, he explained that there's too much evil and Charlie Kirk spreads too much hate. What does that all add up to for you, Freddie?
Yes. I mean, so I think it's important to say the point is never to say that there is no sort of ideological impulse in here.
Yeah.
Clearly, there's an ideological impulse. The point is to say that the ideological impulse is so confused and so wrapped up in the sort of internet communities in which he's been steeped that it marks a clear sort of departure from the kind of political violence that we're familiar with from the 20th century, right? So as someone who is not a terrorism enthusiast, I say, like, to give the devil their due, if you look at people like the Sudanese Liberation Army from the 1970s or the Baader-Meinhof group from Germany, if you look at Puerto Rican separatist movements, if you go back to the Bolsheviks, sort of the Fidel Castro's movement, one of the things that was always true about those groups is, if nothing else, these were extremely studious people. The people who carried out these acts of violence were people who were deeply steeped in actual, like, Marxist doctrine, right? Who actually sort of did the reading, so to speak. I would be shocked if this guy could name, like, so he has like an Italian anti-fascist slogan that he's put on some of the bullets. Which, for the record, is also an online video game meme.
Yeah, something like Bella Ciao.
Bella Ciao, yeah.
Yeah.
Celebrating the death of Mussolini. I would be shocked if he could name 3 historical Italian, anti-fascists or anarchists, right? The point of which meaning, not to say that he doesn't have any sort of political impulse, but the point of which is to say there is such an inherent and deep confusion to all of this. If you were going to write a screenplay, right, you say, okay, I'm going to have a character who's going to be a pro-gay assassin who kills an anti-LGBTQ political figure on a college campus, right? And I really want to sort of make it clear to my audience who that person is. You would not have him inscribe on one of the bullets, LMAO, you are gay. Right? You would not have him inscribe on the bullets instructions for dropping a bomb in a popular video game, right? And so I think some people have interpreted the piece as me suggesting that these kids have no political motivation, but that isn't the point. The point is that they're living in a sort of a cultural environment that has become so sort of devoid of coherent meaning. And they're so steeped in these irony cultures that are specifically designed to bleed everything of meaning that even they don't really know what direction they're pointing in. Again, if you look at Thomas Crooks, he's a guy who we know almost nothing about, despite the fact that he lived online like everybody else did. The only sort of political things that anyone has discovered about him, this is the Trump assassin, the would-be Trump assassin again, he expressed some sort of anti-Semitic content, but in the meme style that is so common in these sort of, edgelord online communities, right? He had prepared a list of potential targets that included Joe Biden and the wife of Prince William of the UK, right? Indicating that he was someone who didn't have any actual political direction that he was pointing in. And so the point of all of this is to say, you take a bunch of young people, you saddle them with a scenario in which home ownership seems like a distant dream, in which the concept of a job that you get when you're 22 and that you have until you're 65, and you have that sense of stability and purpose from it. The idea of purposeful work, right? I mean, if you look at these communities, one of the things that they're also deeply involved in is cryptocurrencies, it's online gambling, it is meme stocks. In other words, it is a get-rich-quick approach to making money. There's no sort of like notion of a noble, slow climb up the economic ladder. You take those sort of conditions, you put these people into these online communities where everyone is competing to be the most sort of nihilistic, the most ironic, the most sort of emotionally dead. And then you let them loose into this chaos of meaning. And it doesn't surprise me that some of them think, okay, I'm going to go shoot up my old private school, it doesn't surprise me that people fight so fiercely after the fact to try to figure out what it all means, because we're trying to wrap our head around where is this coming from.
Does Shane Tamura, to some degree, fit a little bit into this? He was, just to refresh, the Midtown shooter who ended up killing quite a few employees, who weren't affiliated with the NFL, but he was looking for the NFL headquarters in Midtown Manhattan, because, he had played football in high school and I guess suffered from chronic traumatic how do you pronounce it? Encephalopathy, CTE, as it's called, a neurological condition, and felt like, I guess, the NFL had abdicated its responsibility in some way, and the sort of football institutions had abdicated their responsibility to sort of sufficiently warn people about these risks. But he was so incompetent in doing so that he didn't even figure out which floor he was actually targeting. And so people sort of read it as a perhaps more political crime than it was because of who he ultimately targeted, but it ended up being kind of just he was just bad at things. And he sort of seemed almost like, to fill in the blanks a little bit, which is always a little dangerous with these people, somebody who had a lot of prospects in high school, was a really good football star, and then, none of that really came to fruition. He did have a job. Technically, he worked in security somewhere in Las Vegas, but not necessarily somebody with a ton of upward mobility and real prospects for the future. I mean, does Shane Tamura fit into this at all?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a very interesting case because on the one hand, that's someone whose motive, I mean, he was obviously very interested in making a specific motive clear, right? I mean, he included a note on his body saying, please have my brain scanned to find CTE, and he shot himself in the chest to kill himself. And yet at the same time, as you suggested, you can see this fundamental sort of incoherence and confusion going on with everything, where there's a lot of things that are sort of playing into this. One of the things is we don't know that he had CTE, and neither did he. He did not have a formal CTE diagnosis. He was someone who, like a lot of young people, came into young adulthood and felt no clear sense of where to go or where he wanted to be. He was biracial. He's half Asian, and his there's some indication that he felt a lot of the sort of confusion that can afflict biracial people. And in particular, he was too small for his football dreams to sort of continue past high school level. And there's some indication that he blamed his sort of Asian half of his genes for sort of not giving him the physical half to be a professional football player, etc. And so you can sort of see this sort of here where the point is not that this kid wasn't mad about potentially having CTE. I'm sure he was. But the NFL, even if the NFL had sort of enacted sweeping new CTE rules, it wouldn't have affected the high school level play where he played, couldn't retroactively help him. And yeah, he went to the headquarters, but not to the right floor, right? But what he did do, if you watch, there is a video of him approaching the building, and he is strutting up with this assault rifle. And he is walking very purposefully in a way that's obviously meant to appear stylish, right? In other words, like, the kid didn't even know what floor to go to, but he knew to pose for the camera, right? In other words, this desire for visibility and to be seen and to sort of cast yourself in a certain aesthetic when you're on the verge of killing other people and then yourself, right? Sort of speaks to the sense of like living in a culture in which a meme culture, in which, everything is sort of flashes of interest that briefly appear on people's feeds and then fade away, right?
Hmm.
If he really wanted to do damage to the bigwigs in the NFL, there would have been 100 other ways to do so more effectively, right? But this must have appeared to be the most stylish to him.
I mean, what fascinated me about your essay on this was that you're trying to make sense of kind of an increasingly chaotic digital environment. So you referenced like some of the leftist violence of the 1970s, which was organized. It was people meeting in person, and whether it was the weathermen or other groups, they were plotting out these events. And this event and others, we'll get into whether or not there was any coordination, but we can assume that many of these events are maybe people getting hyped up in a Discord chat and then acting out in a way that nobody else really expects, even if they were joking about it. And you draw on chaos theory to try to advance some sort of like bigger understanding of this. I'm going to pull up an image that you embedded of this is called the Lorenz attractor, and maybe you could describe what this image means and how it informs your understanding of the situation we're in.
Sure. So, as you said, these concepts are for chaos theory, which is a branch of mathematics which is concerned with deterministic systems. So that means, in other words, they still obey the law of cause and effect. But even though they're deterministic, right, they are systems where incredibly minor inputs can have very large outsized effects. This one of the sort of places where this was first noticed was in meteorology. So in like the middle of the 20th century, like 1960s, I think, you had scientists working with these computers that were designed to model long-term weather patterns because they believed that they would be able to do that. There was a real optimism that within a few years' time, they would be able to say, okay, in 3 years on this date, it's going to rain, right? Which, of course, famously has not come true, right? What they found, though, was that if they, for example, cut off a long decimal, just a couple digits from the end, they would end up with completely different outcomes in terms of the projected weather with these systems. And so chaos theory sort of concerns these systems where very minute differences in initial conditions cause totally different outcomes, right? And so there's all kinds of ways that people sort of model these things. There are the kinds of pendulums that have multiple arms, for example, where if you set them off and you put an ounce more pressure or the angle is off by 1 degree or whatever, and then you trace their paths through the air, they'll be completely different, right? That's a sort of chaotic system. So the Lorenz attractor is a demonstration of this weird tendency in chaos theory for there to be patterns in that which is fundamentally not predictable. So if you see here, it looks like a loop, right? But if you actually pay attention to it, it's not a perfect loop. It never settles into a groove. So I should sort of probably define an attractor, right? An attractor, like, for example, in a pendulum has a fixed attractor, meaning if I set off a pendulum, no matter how I set it off, eventually it's going to come to rest at the bottom, right, relative to gravity. That's a fixed point, so it's a fixed attractor. There are also loop attractors, which loop endlessly and cycle over and over again. There's many natural cycles that are sort of loop attractors. But this is a chaotic attractor, this Lorenz attractor, which is things fall into what appear to be patterns, but because slight differences in the initial conditions can create large changes, it never actually settles into one perfectly predictable thing. And the sort of analogy I'm making here is simply that if you take these kids, and I apologize for keep calling them kids, but that's what they are very often. If you take these young men, they will often see themselves in very particular circumstances and in very particular ways. They'll define themselves very differently from other people who perform these acts of violence. They'll be from different areas, different demographics, and yet they keep sort of finding themselves falling into these same predictable patterns of increasing sort of online radicalization, even if it's radicalization to no conceivable sort of ideology, and then sort of finally sort of committing acts of violence. And that's sort of the pattern that I'm seeing here, which is so many of these disparate young men across the country end up picking up an assault rifle. And you can sort of look at you can go back sort of through the history of mass shootings or school shootings, and you say, these people are actually quite different in many ways, and yet they arrive in the same pattern. And that's what I'm talking about.
And is there something, and this pattern is emergent from the kind of the bottom dropping out in terms of meaning in our society, as well as the technological conditions, the fact that now there's this connection is happening in this disembodied way. Are those working together in your telling to create this loop, this attractor?
I mean, look at the conditions that we've created in the last 25 years, right? You have decline in religiosity, right? And not just religiosity itself, but the sort of the notion of these broad, overarching, meaning-making systems that human beings have, right? You have the demise of community. So more and more Americans have a smaller and smaller social networks. They're much less likely to do things. The young people, the rates at which they participate in sports or they participate in clubs is going down and down and down. More and more people have no sort of meaningful social connections outside of the internet. So now people are lonely and disconnected from each other. And then, the internet is a window into all the things you want and you can't have, right? These kids open up Instagram and what do they see? They see cars they can't drive. They see houses they can't live in. They see vacations they can't take. They see girls they can't fuck, right? They see a life that they cannot have, and which is being presented to them every day in a feed they check 100 times a day. Every time they get a spare moment, they hit refresh. And they're being bombarded with people who are giving them false visions of what a good life looks like. They see no possible a potential route to get there. They've been taught by their culture to see sort of slowly building up a nice, comfortable life for themselves. It's a sucker's game. And they feel trapped, right? And I just think that it's almost a wonder that we don't see more of this violence than that we do. I mean, you mentioned the Days of Rage, which is what the Weather Underground was doing in the 1970s.
Yeah.
The Days of Rage, the Weather Underground said, we know that we're not going to take out the U.S. government by setting off some bombs. The idea was to erode the sort of social, the sense of social control that keeps people from setting off bombs. And in fact, in the 1970s, for many of the years in the 1970s, hundreds and hundreds of bombs were exploded across the United States. Many of them by people sort of in sympathy with the Weather Underground, but many of them we just don't even know why they were set off because people were setting off bombs and that was the thing to do. Or in the piece I mentioned, Propaganda of the Deed, which is these Italian anarchists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries who kept killing really important heads of state. For example, William McKinley, was killed by a man named Leon Czolgosz, who was an anarchist. The concept of propaganda of the deed is that when you start killing important people, it shows ordinary people that they can kill important people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the world is still emerging from that point from hereditary nobility. We're still sort of stuck in these prestige sort of hierarchies, and the idea of propaganda of the deed was we're going to show everyone, no, you can go up and you can just put a bullet in somebody's head, right? I mean, until the 1970s, an ordinary person could just walk into the Congress building. I don't know if people realize that. The world was much less locked down back then. And so the point again is the sort of 20th century idea is you radicalize people into a certain sort of ideology, and then they pursue that ideology and they decide to kill people to fulfill that ideology. But what seems to me to be much more 21st century is just you create an atmosphere in which it seems like everybody is doing it. You demonstrate to people how sort of easy it is to sow destruction, and then you reward them with attention after they're killed or captured.
I am really curious about this sort of contagion effect. I wonder a little bit about the sort of sickening social media celebrations. Do we have
Yeah.
the not martyr material clip that we can roll, John?
Yeah.
Or Zach?
The best part of this whole goddamn thing is that he is not martyr material, so his death will mean nothing. It will activate no one. It will impact few. It's just great.
I mean, there's something really crazy to me about like, first of all, I mean, what she's saying of like his death will impact no one. He, his life was sort of pointless. His death is sort of pointless. I mean, there's a nihilism that she's pointing to there. It's also just kind of disgusting. I don't know. The thing I just keep coming back to is these people are so odd in that I think many of these same folks who are celebrating this, if they were actually exposed to violence right in front of them, would be repulsed by it. These are the types who frequently talk a lot about trauma and sort of emphasize, lots of parts of therapy culture and take the bad things that happen rightfully seriously and have a fair amount of, I believe, insulation from actual exposure to true violence. And yet they're willing to sort of very glibly dismiss violence that ends somebody's life as just sort of this trivial thing. I mean, how does contagion theory, and this sort of feedback existing guarantee more spectacular acts of violence to come? What's your theory here?
Yeah, I mean, that clip is particularly interesting because, I mean, she's demonstrably wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like, he immediately became a martyr, right? In a way that I would never, if you had asked me, like, beforehand, like, if Charlie Kirk, I knew who Charlie Kirk was, and he's a fairly prominent conservative activist. But if you had said that, like, if you asked me, like, predict how big of a deal it would be if he was assassinated, I wouldn't have thought that it would be this big, right? And it's weird because it's like she's on TikTok.
Sorry, if I could just like interject one thing there, because I'm someone who I never really engaged with Charlie Kirk's content before this. I'm a libertarian, not interested in conservative and MAGA politics to that degree. But even I, like, in the wake of this, like, felt it and saw, like, I just saw a guy on a stage engaging in a conversation, whether you like that spectacle or the way he did it or not, that's what it was. And it's hard for me not to look at that as a sort of free speech martyrdom outside of the content of what he's saying.
Isn't it also a class solidarity thing, Zach, where it's like our jobs are predicated on our ability to get up in front of cameras or in front of people and speak very freely, and there's this idea of like it's very jarring to watch somebody gunned down for that.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I see it in the same category as the the J. Sweet Charlie people when they were mowed down for making cartoons. I didn't love the cartoons they were drawing of the Prophet Muhammad, but I also see people who are killed for expressive acts as you are making them into martyrs. But I didn't mean to derail you, Freddie. Sorry. So continue with your point.
No, it's okay. I mean, Charlie Hebdo, I think, is a really good example.
Yeah.
But that is to me is, the perfect example of the other kind, the old school kind. Like that is ideological violence, right?
Yeah.
You had dedicated Muslim extremists who were opposed to the depiction of the prophet, and so they killed the people who did it, right? There's there was a march afterwards, a solidarity march with Charlie Hebdo. And there's a guy who is my spirit animal, is a French guy who was carrying a sign because he felt the same way that you did, which is that he didn't really love the provocation, but of course he wanted to fight for the free speech rights. And so he had a sign that said in French, I'm marching, but I'm aware of the confusion and hypocrisy of this situation, which is kind of my approach to everything.
Yeah.
But to return to that young woman in the TikTok,
Mm-hmm.
she's cognizant of the concept of political martyrdom. She is obviously speaking directly about, the concept of the consequences of his killing and how it might animate people. She's very aware of that. And yet she, first of all, is apparently unaware that her video clip is going to be used to demonstrate the callousness
Great
of people
point.
who, and also she was just wrong about how this was going to animate people after his death, right? I think that's a bunch of things that go into this. One of the things is it's just always true that, people will always find a way to excuse things happening on their side. After this happened, on Substack notes, I was seeing all the things popping up about, not celebrating death or being appropriately respectful of people when they die, or everyone needs to take a stand against political violence. And there were some people who I knew sort of what their past engagement on these questions was. So I would just click their profile and go back and find them making light of political violence from the other side. So, for example, I found several people who so openly mocked the fact that Nancy Pelosi's husband was almost beaten to death with a hammer, right? Not that long ago, and said, "Hey, here you are posting a funny meme about this guy almost getting bludgeoned to death by a maniac, right?" So there's just that. There's the power of partisanship, which bends people's minds in these ways. But you have to look at the discursive environment in which she's in, right? She wants attention, right? And being extreme is a way to get attention, right? And so she's on TikTok, and certainly she knows that there will be backlash, but she also knows that backlash results in attention. And so you can apply that to all of this stuff, which is if you're going to go out, a lot of people want to go out in a way that sort of calls attention to themselves, right? And so that there is a sort of theatricality to all of it, like the Abundant Life shooter from Minneapolis from a month or so ago. All this weird iconography in their completely incomprehensible manifesto, right? Like you cannot derive a meaningful philosophy from that. But what you can do is see like constituent pieces of meaning from other sort of groups and sort of trying to stitch them together. And then but it's also, I go out and everyone notices me finally, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Thomas Crooks was the main character for a few days, right?
But yeah, I mean, although not to this degree, it seems like maybe it's because of his more inscrutable motivations. I'm not sure.
Maybe
he
it's
missed.
because
This
Trump
also.
survived.
He missed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
So yeah, if he had actually killed him, but yeah, I mean, when I see that TikTok video and several others like it, and people sharing far and wide, a lot of it, as you suggest, Freddie, for the purpose of showing how horrible these people are. It does seem like with the theory you're laying out, that it's almost inevitable that there will be more if this is what happens when someone like Charlie Kirk gets killed, because it's just a fact that you're going to get rewarded with this kind of attention, whether you are Tyler Robinson or Luigi Mangione. There's going to be social media virality, people celebrating you, and then people reacting to the celebrations. Like, do you think that people are aware that they are contributing to that, and that the inevitable outcome is that they're feeding in to the next one? Do they want that on some level?
No, I mean, I think I think very often people get themselves into trouble because they are incapable of understanding themselves as an object of public attention. Like I'm guessing this young woman is regretting having put this thing on TikTok, right? But I mean, one of the things that social media is designed to do is to encourage impulsive participation, right? Like, I mean, part of the reason why the 2010s were the decade of the Twitter cancellation, the Twitter meltdown, is because people said stupid shit they didn't think over, and they sort of just popped it up there, and then it changed their lives forever, right? And so it's all a very toxic sort of stew. But again, like, you would think that if you were someone who was really dedicated to like LGBTQ rights, you would build into your understanding the potential for backlash here, right? Like, if you're Tyler Robinson and you're primarily motivated or solely motivated by the desire to help trans people, right? Killing Charlie Kirk does essentially nothing for you, right? But what it does do is it engages the whole country in the sentiment about the concept of trans extremism, right, or whatever, because he was supposedly motivated by his girlfriend or his roommate or whatever. You know, a part of me is like, how can you be so stupid, right? If that's actually your motivation, right? And I just think, again, like, there's a lot of people in the world who are just looking for a reason to reach for that gun, right? They've been steeped in a culture that sees violence as the most sort of pure form of self-actualization. They don't feel any other outlets, and they feel like everything is sort of pointless and powerless. And they'll find one way to the gun or another, you know?
I want to present an I don't know if it's an alternative, but it's maybe a darker hypothesis or reading that may or may not conflict with what you're saying. You tell me. And it's one that is being widely stated now, mostly by people on the right, that the left has created the conditions for this moment via decades-long insistence that it's acceptable to shut down speech with violence. And I mean, there's data that supports this. I can pull up just one example from FIRE that's been doing this kind of polling for a long time. You see the question here is, how acceptable would you say it is for students to engage in the following actions to protest a campus speaker? Shouting down, blocking, using violence, all on the upswing there. This is polling from the Institute for Economics and Peace, asking people whether they feel violence is justified in advancing political goals in the United States. You see a sharp uptick in the 2019 era among both Democrats and Republicans, but Democrats leading the way. Actually, it's an even slower build going back to 2016 there. So, you know, the hypothesis is that Democrats and the left have been sort of creating this environment of celebration and dehumanization of half the country. How much a role do you think that kind of rhetoric and those ideas have played?
Well, it's hard to say because, I mean, when we're talking about these acts, they are, of course, they remain statistically extremely unlikely and are built on sort of the outlier behavior of people who are at the very least extreme or, you know, often quite disturbed. And so certainly any individual person could be sort of pushed in that direction. I would say, first of all, like, I think Democrats is certainly the wrong frame for this. I mean, Democrats, Democrats are about as threatening as, you know, as a Yorkshire Terrier, you know, like they're not really into the whole muscular, like sort of leftism sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, and every major Democratic figure has condemned this shooting. We should be clear.
Including Rashida Tlaib and AOC and Bernie Sanders.
And Mamdani.
And Mamdani and all the people associated with the left flank of the party. It's also interesting because that sentiment I would identify with the identitarian sort of wing of the left and not the socialist wing of the left. The American socialist movement has never been very violent. If you actually look at the history of the American socialist movement compared to the socialist movements of major European places, especially South America, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, the American socialist movement has never sort of been bent in that direction. What's interesting is just, I mean, anyone who's read me for a long time knows that I'm part of a tradition of sort of the socialist left that is highly critical of identitarianism. I think people tend to not understand this because it sort of troubles sort of easy ideological lines, but the original critics of identity politics was the socialist left. I mean, before the right knew what identity politics was, you had people like Eric Hobsbawm or Michael Parenti, et cetera, Richard Rorty, Barbara Ehrenreich, et cetera, criticizing identity politics from the left. That's sort of my milieu. One of the weird things that happened in the 2010s, a profoundly weird decade, especially for the left, was that you had the rise of what we on the socialist left called the rad lib sort of constituency, which is a rad lib is someone who is very deeply invested in a self-presentation that is radical, that is challenging, that is far left. but whose actual political positions are fundamentally liberal positions, right? Who are not committed anti-capitalists or who don't have a real sort of structural critique of what's happening. They're people who are just really passionate about identity issues and who tend to have a sort of eliminationist rhetoric like the kind you're talking about.
Yeah.
That became the cool thing to be in the 2010s. I think Tumblr and Twitter had a huge part to do with that in terms of mainstreaming the sort of rad lib sentiment and making it popular to sort of engage in that sort of thing. So I don't know, to the degree to say, like, do I think that is sort of influencing these men individually? I don't know. I do know that whole sort of posturing about punching fascists and stuff from people who never leave their MacBooks, it was always useless. It led to nothing. It had no meaningful organizing principle. It was an imposition on free speech, which remains a cherished left-wing virtue no matter what they say. And it was just part of a wholly pointless turn in left politics that I think was due to a lot of bad factors, especially the influence of social media. And I hope very much that we are sort of emerging from that period, but it's hard to say.
I don't want to give too much credence to individual random tweeters, but I am curious about what you're saying here, the sort of hypothesis you're laying out of like the rad lib rhetoric didn't lead to anything. Because one thing that really has freaked me out is the sort of infamous tweet, "What did y'all think decolonization meant? Vibes, papers, essays, losers," which has become a little bit of a parody of itself. It's become a meme. But have we seen a little bit of this market shift from, you know, going, maintaining this very radical aesthetic presentation and yet having pretty mainstream views to something more, something that is more like Black Panther-y, though obviously sort of different, but something that legitimately justifies sort of revolutionary violence. Um, or do you think that maybe that's just not as big of a threat? We're not going to see, domestic terrorism like in the 1970s. We are rather going to see nihilistic terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, look, as far as I know, the person who sent that tweet never actually set off a bomb, right? I mean, I've been saying this for a long time. Like, it's like, look, like, I mean, look, it just literally is true that like decolonization lives in academic papers and conferences and stuff like that, right? And tweets. Like, it's not. There is no organized anti-colonial terrorist movement in the United States, right?
But I guess what I'm curious about is like, are tweets like that and sort of the rhetoric like that, does that seed something, does that like normalize and seed something bigger that really does want to see that brought into reality come to fruition?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is my position has always been that if you're going to take this tack, right, I don't agree with it on basic civil libertarian grounds. I also don't agree with it because it's not going to do anything. But if you're going to say it, you have to do it, right? So all the people who are debating the abstract concept of punching a Nazi or whatever, my position is like, look, go punch the Nazi and let's work it out then. But they don't, right? Because for them, it is a fight about an abstract principle, and it's just a way to sound tough. There was in the 2010s and 2020, there was so much of this empty posturing about the sort of willingness to commit political violence by people who have never committed political violence and never will, right? If they actually had a movement where they were out there committing these acts of violence, I wouldn't approve of it, but it would have at least some sort of meaningful instantiation in real life. What it does is, first of all, it contributes to your opponent's conception of you as someone, as a movement full of people who are unable to defend themselves. It helps the Trump administration make you look like extremists for no tangible material purpose at all, right?
I
So
guess what is lingering with me is it's hard to separate this from the Luigi Mangione crime because, first of all, the killer engraved messages on his bullets just like Luigi did. What followed his killing of a healthcare executive, Brian Thompson, was outright celebrations, much as we've seen with Charlie Kirk. We had actual journalists going on TV and expressing joy in the wake of that. And it's, I think that you're going to see that in whatever the ideological flavor of a deranged killer is. When there's a quote unquote right wing killer, you're going to see some valorization, but it seems like it's usually like subterranean. It's on the message boards where we don't like to look, and it's coming from anonymous people with frog avatars and stuff like that. Here, it's like people proudly proclaiming their support and adoration and lust for these people, and like proudly putting their faces out there. And there's something I haven't seen anything like that before. It seems like a unique new moment where people are just really incentivizing more of it by putting their own face out there and attaching themselves to an embrace of political violence. Am I wrong about that historically? Am I overstating?
No, I mean, look, one of the interesting things about Luigi Mangione is that he is a example of someone who engaged in one of these, spectacular acts of public violence who no one is sort of fighting over who owns him. So,
Yeah.
there is still considerable amount of a back and forth about to what degree Tyler Robinson represents any ideology, the left or something else or whatever. The shooter who killed a Minneapolis area state lawmaker and their spouse, and shot another lawmaker, seems pretty clear to me, who registered Republican, lifelong anti-abortion activist, conservative Christian, whose best friend and wife described him as extremely right-wing. But, people always find a way to sort of wriggle out of that. But that kind of ex post facto sort of lawyering of who someone belongs to does not sort of occur with Luigi Mangione.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because he doesn't really have a manifesto, right? Like, there is still the act itself is so obviously sort of oriented towards a particular political sort of project that nobody sort of needs to hear from him.
I mean, he did leave a note.
You have to know, like, but
Yeah.
I mean, like what's unclear is what he thought would happen from this
Right.
action, right? Like, it seems more like to have been an act of petty revenge than anything else. I don't, look like, I would hope that there would be like a recognition of the fact that, how can I put this? The government, the state now has satellites that can read your T-shirt from space, if you follow me. Like the technological advantage of the state relative to any kind of revolutionary movement is now so overwhelming that it's just useless to sort of engage in this sort of thing, right? When Fidel was in the jungle in Cuba, right? The Cuban government had certain military advantages, but fundamentally it was just two different groups of dudes with rifles in the jungle, right? The state has MRAPs. The state has drones. The state knows where you are at all times because of your cell phone, right? Like the technological advantage is such now that I would hope people would say, there is no hope for an armed leftist revolution in the United States. Again, I don't think Luigi Mangione thought he was participating in that. Maybe he was doing this in the sort of propaganda of the deed sort of way of trying to show people that these people can be killed. Could there be copycats? I suppose there could be, but like the immediate evidence is instead that this stuff is all over the place, right?
Well,
like
it's an open question whether to what degree he was being Charlie Kirk's killer was being egged on by others in his digital network,
Right.
or not. Kash Patel was being questioned by Josh Hawley the other day and implied, we can put on our appropriate skepticism hat for anything coming out of Kash Patel's mouth at this point. But I want to play this clip because it caught my attention because he's implying something a little more sprawling. And I wondered what you made of this as someone who's like trying to unravel the technological aspect. John, could you play that?
Unfortunately, it has been leaked that there was a Discord chat, and for those unfamiliar with it, it's a gaming chat room online that the suspect participated in. So what we're doing, we've already done, is serve legal process, not just on Discord, so that the information we gathered is sustained and held in a evidentiary posture that we could use in prosecution should it be decided to do so. And we're also going to be investigating anyone and everyone involved in that Discord chat.
Okay, very good. I see the public reports that the Discord thread had as many as 20 additional users. It sounds like you're trying to run down all of that to see if that's accurate, who else may have been on that thread, what they may have known. Is that fair to say?
It's a lot more than that, and we're running them all down.
It's a lot more than 20?
Yes, sir.
And you're running all of that to ground?
Every single one.
Yeah, fantastic.
So we know that there was lots of communication on Discord about this event in the aftermath. Here's one screenshot that was published by Ken Klippenstein. Charlie Kirk got shot, dead. I saw the video. Holy shit, rip, I guess. Bro didn't deserve to go out like that. Sad. And then this user, Zealous Monkey, is allegedly the shooter. Hey guys, I have bad news for you all. It was me at UVU yesterday. I'm sorry for all this. I'm surrendering through a sheriff friend in a few moments. Thanks for all the good times and laughs. You've all been so amazing. Thank you all for everything. Clearly someone who this group meant a lot to him, that he's saying his last goodbyes. What do you think about the prospect of like what role at this point do you think Discord and his relationships on there played in this event?
Well, I think in the most abstract sense, right, you can say that this is likely a guy who had very few in real life sort of commitments that were as important to him as his online ones, right?
Yeah.
Which again is a sort of an ongoing sort of theme with so many of these school shooters in particular, that when you investigate them, they sort of identify their most important sort of connections, or at least after the fact, you can identify the most important connections as those that are happening online, right?
Yeah, there was this really sad, to me at least, photo circulating of him online. This is a post from his mother, when he's a kid, saying, "Almost forgot Tyler. He can totally avoid us now that he got all of the computer accessories he's been wanting." And you just see him kind of, locked in there at the laptop. So yeah, I mean, is this like a kind of validation of the Jonathan Haidt thesis that like we've all got a little bit too much online brain, and it can lead to some really dark places?
I mean, I definitely think that the way that online discourse works contributes to how these kids work. And I don't know how you could kind of doubt that at this point. But
Right.
again, like, suppose that you're the FBI and you chase some of these Discord users down, right? Even if you discussed talking about doing violent acts, I can guarantee you that they would say, "Oh, I didn't know he was actually going to do it. It was all for the lulz." And that was one of the things. It's one of the things that defines these communities is they are, they always live on the knife's edge of I'm being serious, no, I'm not, right? Like this indeterminacy about how serious anything is, which is something that crops up again and again in these sort of extremist cases. And in fact, if you go back to that to Columbine in 1999, right? Like one of the OG sort of nihilistic acts of violence.
Yeah.
Some people have suggested, and that, I don't know how accurate this is, but some analysts have suggested that Dylan Klebold, who was sort of the number 2 man in that crime, didn't even really know for sure that they were actually going to do it until maybe a month before it happened. In other words, that he and Eric Harris had talked about shooting up their school for ages, and had all these plans, but that it had been sort of bathed in the same sort of sarcasm and irony these kids always tend to live in. And so it wasn't clear until quite close to the actual event that he realized that Eric Harris intended to go through with it. And that's just sort of thing. I just think like it is just to live constantly in irony and LOL, to sort of constantly bathe yourself in this performance of emotionlessness, this sort of affectless sort of nothing matters sort of thing. You can say that it's a joke, and maybe for many people it is, but I don't think you can sort of live in those spaces 24 hours a day, as so many people do, and not have it sort of eventually corrode your basic sense of like, what meaning means, right? Like
Yeah.
it's going to infect something. But like I said, I highly doubt that there were like individual people on his Discord who were coordinating with him and saying, yeah, go do this for real. It's much more likely that they just helped contribute to an environment where the line between what's serious and what's not has dissolved, you know?
I see the Red Scare Girls as the opposite version of this, right? Like a
Right, like a
redemptive arc
redemptive
where it started off as like more nihilism and vocal fry and sort of irony and became more authentic and sincere in kind of a cool way and more sort of like politically cohesive. I mean, they're also maybe just smarter than a lot of these crazy online nihilists.
Yeah.
Or maybe just being women is helpful to them in this case. But I'm sort of curious. I mean, like, what is the fix for all of this? You do not have to have all of the answers. I think you've laid out a really good sociological sort of diagnosis of what's going on here. But to some degree, a lot of this sort of Robert Putnam bowling alone stuff started, that came out 25 years ago. And now we've had sort of the resurgence of some of that. We have, I joked about Ross Douthat earlier. You mentioned Jonathan Haidt. Derek Thompson has also been really advocating this hypothesis of like the pandemic certainly exacerbated some of these problems. We have really, astonishing rates of mental illness, but also like deep loneliness, which I don't know if that necessarily, in some ways that sort of transcends category. Um, is there any actual fix to any of this, or is this something where we just have to watch it get worse over the course of our lifetimes?
I mean, it's probably going to get worse if I'm being realistic. I do think like, look, I mean, part of it is like cultures of hopelessness, um, like, so for example, when these things have a political sort of patina, political justification, like Luigi Mangione, who I think is his own thing, but um, part of why so many people sort of were willing to be publicly celebratory about that. And I think if you look, well, yes, it certainly has a left-wing sort of bent. There's a lot of people who were sort of functionally apolitical who still sort of did the Luigi's sort of political sort of celebration thing. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that healthcare sucks in this country. Everybody hates it. There is literally no political ideology or group who defends the status quo. There is a great deal of rancor about how it should be changed, but there is like no human being alive who is like, yeah, this is the best possible system, right? It traps people in this sense of absolute sort of impotence. Like if you've ever tried to navigate, like trying to get your insurance to pay for something that it doesn't want to, and it feels totally politically unaddressable. It just doesn't feel like there's anything that we can do about it. That, first of all, is something that is always going to sort of provoke people into sort of Luigi Mangione direction. But yeah, it's, you just have to be careful what you ironize, I am someone who would very much have, and maybe still does, identify with the ironization of the white collar lifestyle that I was talking about. Like, I like those movies. I understand the critique that says that they're meaningless. I laugh along when they point out how pointless that kind of work is, the TPS reports and the shuffling paper from one side of the desk to the next. I do think that that's a sort of spiritual deadening thing to do. But again, what's the alternative, right? Like, there are a lot of people who go and get nice jobs at the corporate office at Geico, and they have kids and they have houses and they live happy lives, right? And they don't necessarily need to find meaning in the like white collar work that they do. We have just become so much more adept at ironizing everything and undermining everything and sort of poking holes in everything, right? And this is why, I guess Twitter isn't what it used to be, but there's always been a sort of on Twitter, like, yes, there's a sort of like passionate leftist crowd, but there's also this sort of irony bro crowd underneath that just sees everything as meaningless, that ironizes and laughs at everything, and that relentlessly sort of harps on how nothing can be improved, right? And I don't know how you fight that tendency, but one of the things the internet is very good at, right, is creating a sense within people that their darker impulses are shared by many other people. Right. One of the reasons that things like anti-Semitism or whatever have promulgated is because you can find like-minded people who say, oh, no, it's not just you. There's lots of us. Right. And I think that this sense of meaninglessness and hopelessness is a huge part of that. I don't know how you address it, but there has to be some sort of really committed attempt to address that national myth making in a way that helps people to see like there's a lot of great things you can do with your life. But as long as the only thing that looks attractive to people is being an influencer or whatever, or having that house that you see on Instagram and that car, etc., you're just going to be generating a lot of young people who are really, really disaffected and unhappy. And men are the ones who commit violence. So,
I mean, to be really cynical for one moment, didn't we used to fill some of this void of meaning with patriotism? Which, you're an intense leftist, we're libertarians. Like, was that exactly a good use of, was that exactly a good way to fill this void?
well, I don't know.
I mean,
I'm not much of a patriot, but
yeah, that's what I'm sort of gesturing at. Like, none of us exactly want a populace that's like overly trusting of the
right.
state, but that was one,
Okay.
balm for the weary soul that people used to rely on.
Okay. So, but let's look back at like the heyday of the American far left, which is like the 1910s, 19 teens through like the 1950s or early 1950s, right? The American labor movement and Eugene Debs and et cetera, et cetera. That was a remarkably optimistic movement. It was a movement that was really big into iconography. It stressed solidarity. It stressed the communal aspect, right? It was involved a very deep belief in progress, right? It had all of this sort of built-in, like positive symbolism that people could draw on. If you are someone who discovers socialism online, that's how most people discover socialism now, and you're most likely going to do it on Twitter or somewhere like that. And you're going to see that most of the socialists that you interact with are of the lol, nothing matters, everything sucks, nothing can get better sort of variety, right? And so that's not providing you with the emotional sucker for what you need. So yeah, patriotism is one thing, but also like, the left used to be an optimist movement, right? Or look at like anti-work, which I think is the stupidest shit I've ever heard of, right? Like there's an anti-work movement, very popular Reddits, whatever. People associate that with the political left. I tell people all the time, the left is a labor movement, right? The core of the symbolism of the left is the valorization of work, right? And it's that sort of thing that I'm talking about. Like this, it just seems like everybody is busily engaged in the task of just undercutting every sort of meaning-making thing that we have.
It's I mean, what I'm getting from this is that what they call the black pill is perhaps the thing that to be resisted across all ideologies, because you can take it, this relentless pessimism, and LOL, nothing matters, that can infect anyone wherever your ideological starting point is.
Right.
And you also, I mean, one thing that was interesting to me that from your essay was that you said it goes in cycles. There's historical cycles, and there's a version of almost too much meaning or like imposed meaning, and maybe that's what Liz is gesturing at, where if you have the state defining meaning for everyone else, then you get the same sort of violent backlash to that, right? So is it that we're trying to go for like this perfect Goldilocks zone between those two extremes?
Yeah, I don't know. It's like I mean, look, like so much of the sort of hope that people feel when they feel it is sort of wrapped up in nostalgia, right? Make America great again is fundamentally an appeal to the past. Or if you look at Bernie Sanders, right? Whatever you want to say about Bernie Sanders, he's no irony boy, right? He is a vision of
He's sincere.
He's a profoundly sincere figure from an older version of the left when that was the thing to be, and that inspired a lot of people. But then he lost 2 presidential primaries, and a lot of those people who were inspired by him turned directly into the lol, nothing matters kind, right? And I just think that, like, I don't know, man, like, it's appealing to people's individual character is not a solution to this. But so often it's just like, you just got to fucking sack up, man. Like I understand. Okay. Like I have profound sympathy for a young man who is not exceptional in any regard, who's never going to be rich, who sort of comes up into a system that doesn't have a lot of sort of visions of how he can be a sort of successful person, who feels like he'll never get girls, which is like 90% of this for many of them. Like I have a lot of sympathy for that person. but like you just got to keep going. And like if you and your immediate impulse to that feeling is to grab a gun, then you have to stop being such a fucking pussy. You know what I'm saying? Like you have to have it in you to allow that to inspire you to like really try to break out of your life. And one of the things
Yeah.
I find amazing is like to be in a position where before you like sell your possessions to buy a one-way plane ticket somewhere and just try like hell to just completely change your life, before you join the merchant marines or whatever, before like you completely dedicate yourself to something else to radically change your life, your first impulse is to create this destruction like this. Like at least try to go and do something very different. But like
Yeah.
I don't know, man. These guys, they just have such a fundamentally nihilistic perspective. It's really depressing.
Yeah, sack up, have the courage to show some sincerity. I think that's a good message to wrap up really this podcast as a whole. We've tried to do that. I hope that it has come through in the run of this series. I'm going to remind everyone that Liz and I will have some closing messages as we close out Just Asking Questions, the podcast, after we say goodbye to Freddie. But before we do that, Freddie, I'm going to put to you the final question of the show, which we have asked every single guest in keeping with the theme. What is a question that you think more people should be asking?
I think they should be asking, when is the fantastic new novel, The Mind Reels by Freddie deBoer, being released? And the answer to that is October 7th from Coffee House Books, and it's available for pre-order wherever books are sold.
Okay, we'll leave it with a plug for Freddie's book. Thank you so much for coming on the show. You can
Thanks,
also
Freddie.
read his great Substack. Thank you so much, Freddie.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, so we know this is disappointing to the many thousands of people who listen to or watch the show every week. And I want to be transparent and honest that it's disappointing to us as well. But Just Asking Questions is coming to an end. We weren't forced into an abrupt cancellation, but felt that it would be best to finish on a really meaningful conversation like the one we just had with Freddie. Because we set out to make a show, as we mentioned at the end there, that would bring a sincerity, a kind of rigor and focused attention to analyzing current events in the podcast space. Our media environment just flows so quickly. We all get overwhelmed. And this was a chance to slow down, ask some really basic questions about a current event, cite our sources, and show you the material as we reason through it together with a guest we thought had a particularly valuable or interesting insight. It's an approach that I think was worth a try and resulted in some really excellent podcasts. And I'm very proud of the archive we've made and hope some of you who've just jumped on board recently will go back and sift through some of that, because there are some remarkable moments. And, you know, just in the spirit of asking questions, Liz and I needed to ask, how is our time best spent? This kind of show I wanted to do took a lot of prep every week. And maybe that scarce time needed to be directed towards things that have an even bigger impact, things that are already getting a bigger response. So Liz and I are going to keep working together on various projects. Liz is going to continue writing the Reason Roundup, which has great reach and that you really need to subscribe to because it's just one of the best daily news roundups out there. Get your daily dose of Liz. I'm going to double down on the video essays and documentaries that have kind of defined my career at Reason. And I'm planning to take the methodology and podcasting lessons from Just Asking Questions to continue doing long-form interviews that'll go up on the main Reason TV channel and possibly elsewhere eventually. So I just want to thank Reason for the opportunity to run this experiment and really pursue the vision. That's a great thing about Reason. They really do believe in individual vision and not meddling too much and giving writers and creative producers a lot of space to experiment and express themselves and prove out their ideas or not. The organization makes an effort to live up to its Free Minds motto, and it's a big reason I've stayed with them for so long. So thank you to Catherine Mangu Ward, Jim Epstein and everyone else who greenlit this and gave it a chance. Thank you to all of you who listened to supported us and told your friends and wrote thoughtful letters and DMs and so forth that meant a lot and fueled us. Thank you to John Osterhout, our intrepid producer, who made it possible with his grind set and his creative insights, and who I am so grateful to continue to work with on other creative endeavors. And Liz, you know this isn't the end of our creative partnership and certainly not our friendship. You have been a great co-host, someone I can trust, someone who impresses me all the time with your sharp intellect, your quick wit, your moral courage. I've learned a lot from you during this, and I cannot wait to see how things develop professionally and personally for you in these next years. And so I'd like to invite you now to give your final thoughts as well as we wind this down.
I mean, Zach, you've always been a huge force in my life, sort of asking for earnesty and authenticity, when irony would, in fact, perhaps be my first choice. And I think that with this show, we've really lived up to that vision that I think you first sort of articulated, being earnest, being thoughtful, and more than anything, being unafraid. And I feel as though we've given something to our viewers that is at times maybe less intoxicating than the short form, quick hits alternatives that they have access to in our media environment, but that's a little bit meatier and a little bit more challenging. And I hope we've led well by example by being unafraid to ask difficult questions, but also being unafraid to ask the questions that seem stupid and obvious, because I think that sometimes getting back to basics is actually what the moment requires and asks of us. Zach, what's one question that you think more people should be asking?
I think it's, where are you putting your attention? How is it shaping you? We are in this media environment where everything wants to grab it. You can focus on the black pilling stuff. You can focus on things that don't really matter. You can be pulled into groups. You can be pulled into digital spaces that are unhealthy. So it's just like your diet. How is what you're putting into your eyeballs and your brain shaping your character and shaping you as a human being? So where are you putting your attention?
I think for
And
me,
Liz, yeah, I would like to know what your final question is.
mine is, what are you attributing to happenstance that you should, in fact, be attributing to the divine?
We'll leave it there. Thanks.